Lorkulup was born into the Black Rock Pride in the vast golden grasslands of Masai Mara, Kenya. Unlike his four older brothers, strong, dominant, and larger in size, he was the youngest and smallest. While his siblings displayed power early on, Lorkulup had to rely on his wits and patience. He often observed the older lions, learning their ways but rarely engaging in their dominance battles. Life in the pride was ruled by a strict hierarchy. The older males controlled the best hunting grounds, claimed the lionesses, and led battles against rival prides. Though Lorkulup was part of the coalition, he was overshadowed by his brothers. Olamina, the eldest, bore scars from past fights, a symbol of his experience. Oliver and Oloshipa followed him closely, respected and feared. Olabar, though younger, still held more status than Lorkulup. While the others hunted and defended territory, Lorkulup often stayed behind. He was not yet trusted with leadership roles. The lionesses regarded him with indifference, and the cubs played with him but did not look up to him. Even among his own blood, he felt like an outsider. His only solace came during the quiet hours of the day, resting under the shade of acacia trees, watching the endless plains stretch beyond the horizon. He dreamed of the day he would prove his worth, though deep down, he feared it might never come. Change came suddenly, as it often does in the wild. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rolling savanna, a rival coalition of male lions invaded Black Rock territory. The intruders were powerful and relentless, seeking to overthrow the current rulers and take over the pride. The battle was brutal. Olamina and the older brothers fought fiercely, their roars echoing across the plains. Lorkulup, untested in battle, hesitated. He watched from a distance as his brothers engaged in a life-or-death struggle, claws tearing through flesh, bodies colliding with the force of thunder. Then the unthinkable happened. One of the intruders lunged at him, seeing the younger lion as an easy target. Lorkulup had no choice but to defend himself. He managed to evade the initial attack, but a sharp claw raked across his nose, leaving a deep wound. Blood dripped down his face and pain surged through his body. In that moment, fear gripped him. He could see his brothers fighting for their survival, yet he could barely hold his ground. The weight of his own weakness crushed him. Instead of standing his ground, he turned and fled into the darkness, his heart pounding. That night, as he lay hidden in the tall grass, his wound stinging, he realized he could no longer be the cub who stood in the shadows. He had to find his strength or he would never belong. Hello guys, if you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us. Lorkulup spent the next few days wandering alone through the outskirts of Black Rock territory. The pain from his wound had lessened, but the shame burned deeper than any physical injury. He had fled the battle while his brothers had fought to protect their pride. He could still hear their roars echoing in his mind, reminding him of his failure. He told himself that survival was instinct, that running was better than dying. But deep down he knew the truth. He had abandoned his family when they needed him the most. The thought made his stomach tighten with guilt. He avoided the pride, fearing the judgment of his brothers and the lionesses. What would they say if they saw him now, weak and hesitant? He imagined their disappointed eyes, the whispers of how he had turned his back on them. For a while he considered leaving for good. Maybe he was not meant to be part of Black Rock Pride. Maybe he was destined to wander alone, avoiding conflict and living in the shadows of stronger lions. But something inside him refused to accept this fate. Then one evening, as he lay beneath a lone tree, he saw movement in the distance. A group of hyenas was circling something. His ears twitched as he recognized the scent. A lion cub, helpless and alone. Lorkulup hesitated. He was not strong enough to fight off the pack, but as the cub let out a desperate cry, something inside him shifted. This was his moment. He could not run again. Summoning every ounce of courage, Lorkulup charged forward, roaring as loudly as he could. The hyenas turned, their eyes narrowing as they sized him up. He was alone, but he did not back down. He lunged at the nearest one, claws swiping. The hyenas hesitated for a brief moment, just enough time for the cub to scramble away into the tall grass. The hyenas, realizing the element of surprise was gone, retreated, snarling in frustration. Lorkulup stood there, his body tense, his breath ragged. For the first time, he had acted without fear. He had stood his ground. A deep, approving growl came from behind him. An older lion stepped out of the shadows. It was a rogue male, a former leader who had been exiled long ago. His golden mane was streaked with grey, and his body bore countless scars from battles long past. "You fought well," the old lion said, his voice low and steady. "But courage alone will not keep you alive." Lorkulup lowered his head, still shaken from the encounter. The older lion studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You ran from your brothers, didn't you?" Lorkulup stiffened but did not deny it. The old lion nodded knowingly. "Then learn," he said. "Strength is not only in the body but in the mind. If you do not fight for your family, you will lose them forever." For the first time in his life, Lorkulup listened, truly listened. The old lion became his mentor, teaching him the skills he had never fully developed: how to track prey, how to fight with strategy, and, most importantly, how to lead. Day after day, they trained together. Lorkulup no longer relied on brute force, but learned how to read the land, anticipate danger, and trust his instincts. He was no longer the weakest of his brothers. He was becoming something more. Weeks passed, and Lorkulup felt a transformation within himself. He was no longer the hesitant lion who had fled from battle. Under the guidance of the old lion, he had sharpened his instincts and gained confidence in his strength. One evening, as they patrolled the outskirts of the savannah, Lorkulup caught the scent of something familiar: his pride. He froze, his heart pounding. He had avoided them for so long, but now a part of him longed to return. The old lion watched him carefully. "You must decide, young one. Do you face them or do you keep running?" Lorkulup hesitated. He was no longer the weak cub they had known, but would they accept him back? Would his brothers forgive him for leaving? Before he could answer, a distant roar cut through the silence. It was not one of his brothers, it was a challenge. Lorkulup's ears perked up. He could see the silhouettes of unfamiliar lions in the distance, advancing toward Black Rock territory, a rival coalition. His pride was in danger. He did not think. He ran toward them, his paws pounding against the dry earth. He was no longer the cub who fled. He was going back, not to ask for forgiveness, but to fight. Lorkulup arrived just in time to see his brothers engaged in battle. The rival males were strong, their muscles rippling as they clashed with the defenders of Black Rock pride. Dust rose in the air, mingling with the scent of blood. His brothers were outnumbered. Olamina was wounded, struggling to keep one of the attackers at bay. Oliver and Oloshipa fought side by side, but exhaustion was setting in. The lionesses and cubs watched from a distance, helpless and afraid. For a split second, Lorkulup doubted himself, but then he saw a lioness shielding the cubs, her eyes filled with terror. He did not hesitate. With a thunderous roar, he lunged at one of the rival males, his claws raking against the intruder's flank. The sudden attack caught the lion off guard, and Lorkulup used that moment to drive him away from Olamina. His brothers noticed him now, but there was no time for words. They fought together, their instincts aligning as if he had never left. The battle raged on, but with Lorkulup's return, the tide shifted. The rival males, realizing they had lost the advantage, began retreating. Their leader snarled in frustration, but knew the fight was over. As the dust settled, Lorkulup stood, panting, his fur stained with blood. His brothers turned to face him. For a long moment there was only silence. Then Olamina stepped forward, his golden eyes studying him. "You came back," he said simply. Lorkulup met his gaze. "I had to." Olamina nodded, and to Lorkulup's surprise he brushed his head against his younger brothers in silent approval. The others followed suit, Lorkulup was no longer the outcast, he was one of them again. But deep inside, he knew the battle was only the beginning. Days passed since the battle, and Lorkulup was no longer the uncertain young lion of the past. His return had strengthened the Black Rock pride, and for the first time, his brothers saw him as an equal. But the pride still faced danger. The rival coalition had been driven away, but they were not defeated. They lurked at the edges of the territory, waiting for an opportunity to strike again. The Black Rock pride had won the battle, but the war was far from over. One evening, as the sky burned orange with the setting sun, Lorkulup noticed something unusual, a lioness missing from the group. His ears twitched as he realized who it was, the mother of the cubs he had once saved. He followed her scent, tracking her through the tall grass. His instincts told him something was wrong. Then he found her. She was cornered by two of the rival males. They circled her like vultures, their hungry eyes fixed on her. She let out a low growl, but she was alone, and she would not be able to fight them both. Lorkulup's heart pounded. He had a choice: run for help or face them himself. He knew the answer before the thought even finished. With a roar, he charged, forward, claws unsheathed, ready to defend her. The fight was brutal. Lorkulup lunged at the first rival, sinking his claws into the lion's shoulder. The second one attacked from behind, knocking him off balance. He hit the ground hard, the breath forced from his lungs. But he refused to stay down. He twisted, kicking the second lion away with his powerful hind legs. The first opponent recovered, baring his teeth in a snarl. Blood dripped from Lorkulup's flank. But he stood his ground, his golden eyes blazing with determination. He was no longer the cub who ran from battle. One of the lions lunged at the lioness, trying to take her down first. Lorkulup reacted instantly, throwing himself between them. Teeth clashed, claws tore through flesh. The lion yowled in pain as Lorkulup sank his fangs into his neck, forcing him to the ground. The second male hesitated. He had expected an easy fight, but Lorkulup was not weak. He was a warrior. Then, the roar of the Black Rock pride echoed through the savannah. His brothers had arrived. The second intruder took one last look at Lorkulup before fleeing into the darkness. The first one, wounded and beaten, struggled to escape as well. The lioness, breathing heavily, turned to Lorkulup, her eyes wide with gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered. Lorkulup stood tall, blood staining his golden fur. He had faced death, and he had won. But he knew this was not the end. The rivals would return, and when they did, he would be ready. The lioness stood beside Lorkulup as the rest of the pride arrived. His brothers took in the scene. Two rivals defeated, the lioness safe, and Lorkulup standing firm, bloodied but victorious. For a moment there was silence. Then Olamina stepped forward, his golden eyes filled with something that had never been there before: respect. "You fought alone," Olamina said, his voice low but steady. "You fought for the pride." Lorkulup met his gaze. "I did what had to be done." Olashipa huffed, a rare smirk playing at his lips. "Looks like our little brother isn't so little anymore." The lionesses watched him with newfound admiration. The cubs peered at him with wide eyes, seeing him not just as a member of the pride, but as a protector, a warrior, a leader. For the first time, Lorkulup felt it. He belonged. That night, as the pride gathered beneath the stars, Lorkulup lay beside his brothers, listening to the steady breathing of the pride. He had returned, not as the weak cub who had fled, but as a lion worthy of his name. But deep in his heart, he knew his journey was not yet complete. The rivals were still out there, and one day they would return. The following weeks were a time of preparation. The pride knew that the rival coalition would not accept defeat so easily. The wounded lions had escaped, but they had left with vengeance in their eyes. Lorkulup trained relentlessly, hunting with precision, strengthening his body and sharpening his instincts. His brothers no longer saw him as the weakest among them. Now they fought alongside him, not ahead of him. One evening, as Lorkulup patrolled the territory, he caught a familiar scent on the wind. The rivals had returned. He did not hesitate. Instead of waiting for the battle to come to them, Lorkulup did something unexpected. He led the charge. With his brothers at his side, he sprinted across the plains, their paws thundering against the earth. The rival males were strong, but Blackrock Pride was stronger. They clashed beneath the blood-red sky. Roars shattered the silence, claws met flesh, teeth tore into muscle. Lorkulup fought with everything he had, standing against the intruders without fear. The Pride fought as one. And this time, there was no retreat. As the battle ended, the rivals lay defeated, driven away for good. The territory was safe. The Pride was whole. And Lorkulup, the once overlooked younger brother, stood as a lion of legend. The battle was over. The rival coalition had been defeated, their broken pride scattered into the wilderness. The Blackrock Pride had won, and for the first time in his life, Lorkulup stood not as the weakest brother, but as an equal among warriors. The scars on his body told the story of the fight, the deep scratches on his shoulders, the bite marks on his flank. But he had survived. He had done more than just survive, he had led. As the dust settled, his brothers gathered around him. Olamina, the eldest, approached first. "You fought like a king today," Olamina said, his voice carrying a rare note of pride. Lorkulup met his gaze. He did not need to reply. His actions had spoken for him. The lionesses and cubs emerged from the shadows, their eyes filled with awe. The cubs playfully pawed at him, their tiny roars echoing his own. The lioness he had saved watched him from a distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Lorkulup had died as the weak, uncertain cub who had once fled, and now he was reborn as a true leader of the Pride. But this wasn't just a victory for him, it was the beginning of something greater. The days following the battle were peaceful. The savannah, once filled with tension and danger, now belonged fully to the Blackrock Pride. Lorkulup no longer sat in the background. When the Pride moved, he moved with them. When the brothers patrolled, he led alongside them. When the lionesses hunted, he watched over the cubs, ensuring their safety. He was no longer the youngest brother trying to prove himself. He was a protector, a leader, a legend. As the sun rose over the golden plains of Masai Mara, Lorkulup stood at the edge of his territory, watching the herds move in the distance. His scars would fade, but his story would live on. And one day, the next generation of cubs would hear the tale of the lion who rose from the shadows to become a king. Lorkulup, the lion of Blackrock Pride. And with that, his journey was complete. If you like our stories and haven't subscribed yet, support our work and subscribe to the channel to help us.